Well, good morning, brethren, and happy Sabbath to you all, and welcome also to everyone who's joining us on Zoom today. Now, the last few times I've been up here, we've been going through a series entitled The Geography of the Holy Land to better appreciate the geographical background of the stories of the Bible and better appreciate the land that God himself chose for his chosen people. Now, so far we've covered the north of Israel, central Israel and southwest Israel, and today we're going to explore southeast Israel. Now, in this part of the series on southeast Israel, we're going to explore three different regions. Now, the first region we're going to look at is the Judean highlands, where Jerusalem, Hebron and Bethlehem are all located. Now, on the opposite side of the watershed formed by the high ridges of the Judean highlands is the next region that we'll explore, the Judean wilderness. Now, most moisture coming in from the coast falls on the coastal side of that watershed, leaving little rainfall to fall in the Judean wilderness, which ranges from being semi-arid to arid. Now, just as dry and arid is the last region we'll conclude with, and that is the Negev, a Hebrew word that means south, that extends all the way from Beersheba and Arad, all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, where Eilat is today. Excuse me. Now, the Judean mountains or Judean highlands is where Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron and several other important biblical cities are located. Now, the mountains reach a height of just over 1,000 metres or 3,300 feet near Hebron. Now, the ancient road that connected Jerusalem and Hebron with Bethel and Shechem in the Samaria region was known as the Ridge Route, or the Way of the Patriarchs. Now, the Judean mountains form the heartland of the kingdom of Judah after the kingdom split into two following the reign of Solomon. Now, Benjamin, where Jerusalem was, also stayed loyal to Judah after that split. Now, at the southwest corner of Benjamin was the town of Kirjath-Jearim, which was the home to the Ark of the Covenant before David brought it up to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was just inside the territory of Benjamin along its southern border with Judah. Now, as you can see here in this map, there's a whole cluster of biblically important places in the tribal area of Benjamin, which we'll look at closer on another map. Now, going south of Jerusalem along that road was Bethlehem, where David was from and where Jesus was born. Now, further south of Bethlehem are the Pools of Solomon, part of the water system for the temple in Roman times. And to the southwest of Bethlehem is the town of Tekoa, where the prophet Amos was from and where God defeated an army in the time of King Jehoshaphat. Now, going further south, Hebron and Mamre are places that Abraham spent much time at. Now, where the Way of the Patriarchs reaches Hebron going south, there was a fork in the road with the Way of the Patriarchs going downhill to the town of Beersheba. And there was another road that went down to the town of Arad. Now, on that road going south to Arad was three places that David spent time at when he was on the run from Saul, the towns of Ziph, Carmel and Moan. Now, to the west of Hebron are three places that were a part of Joshua's conquest: Makkedah, Eglon and Debir. Now, on the map on the right there, that shaded area is the area that's today called the West Bank. That's very much in the news. Now, most of the Judean highlands lies within the West Bank. Now, this area was captured from Jordan by Israel during the Six-Day War of 1967. Now, while Israel has overall control, certain parts within the West Bank, designated Area A, are off limits to Israeli citizens. Now, places such as Bethlehem and Hebron are Area A. Now, tourists can visit these places, but not with a car registered from Israel. Now, notice on the map on the right how the West Bank narrows half as wide near Jerusalem. Now this is where the amount of flat land in the Judean highlands narrows due to the very deep valleys and high peaks of the upper Sorek Valley west of Jerusalem. Now here's a map of the tribal area of Benjamin. Now down the middle is the way of the patriarchs. Now on the left there you can see the two roads that come up from the coast. The Beth Horon route in the north and the Kirjath Jearim route in the south. Now those two roads joined up at the town of Gibeon and met up with the way of the patriarchs at Samuel's hometown of Ramah, which is one of the lowest points in the central highlands and a good place to cross the highlands to then head on towards Jericho. Now in ancient times, to get to Jerusalem from the coast, you would go up one of those two roads past Gibeon. Then after you get to Ramah, you would then turn south to get to Jerusalem. Now there was also a very difficult direct route from Kirjath Jearim to Jerusalem that goes up and down some very deep valleys and gorges where Highway 1 goes through today. Now notice the route called the Zeboim route that went uphill to the way of the patriarchs from Jericho. Now it forked with one road going up to Ramah and the other going up to Bethel and the north via the small fortress of Ai. Now Ai guarded that road, hence why it was important for Joshua to conquer and control Ai. Now the other steeper route going up to the central highlands from Jericho was the ascent of Adummim, which went up directly to Jerusalem and was the scene for the Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. Now notice south of the town of Gibeon here and west of Saul's capital Gibeon is the place that's called the High Place of Gibeon. Now this is quite an impressive mountain to the northwest of Jerusalem, and it was where the temple was during the reign of David and also the early part of Solomon's reign. Now Kirjath Jearim was a city on the approach up to Jerusalem on Benjamin's western border. Now its name means City of the Woods. Now when the ark was at nearby Beth Shemesh, many people died after looking into the ark, probably not unlike the scene at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now they should have known better, as Beth Shemesh was a Levitical city and they should have known God's laws about the ark. Now Kirjath Jearim wasn't a Levitical city, but a priest named Abinadab and his son Eleazar lived here. Now as it was close to Beth Shemesh, the ark was brought to the hill where Abinadab's house was. Now you can see in this photo here the hill at Kirjath Jearim where a Catholic church today commemorates the time of the ark being here. Now David likely took the northern route via Gibeon rather than the very difficult direct route that I mentioned before. Now on the way, Uzzah died after the ark came off the ark ox cart on the road towards Gibeon, where it stayed for 3 months at the house of Obed-Edom before David got it right and later brought it up to Jerusalem. Now archaeologists at Kirjath Jearim now believe that they've actually identified Kirjath Jearim as the New Testament town of Emmaus, thanks to the discovery of fortifications from the 2nd century BC. Now Kirjath Jearim is actually the same distance of 9 miles that Emmaus was from Jerusalem, as mentioned in the book of Luke. Now Emmaus was where Jesus disappeared before 2 disciples after his resurrection, after he probably adjusted his appearance and they finally recognised him. Now Kirjath Jearim is also well known for its Elvis American diner. That's the first thing that you see as you exit on the climb up to the coast, from the coast, sorry. Now south of the town of Bethel was the town of Mizpah, which is in the northern part of the area of Benjamin, which is believed to be Tel en Nazba. Now Mizpah means watchtower, And this was where Samuel gathered Israel before a victory that God gave to them against the Philistines. Now it was also at Mizpah where Samuel also gathered Israel together to choose a king by lot, and there they proclaimed Saul as king of the nation. Now Mizpah later on was also the base of Gedaliah, the governor of the new Babylonian province that Judea was a part of following the Babylonian conquest by Nebuchadnezzar. Now we read in the book of Jeremiah how he went to Mizpah along with others, including Zedekiah's daughters, through whom God would keep the throne of David alive. Now the governor Gedaliah foolishly rejected advice that led to his murder at the hands of the untrustworthy Ishmael, who captured Jeremiah's group, but they were later rescued by the pool of Gibeon. Now going just south of Mizpah on the way of the patriarchs is the town of Ramah, which is today called Al-Ram. Now this was the home of the prophet Samuel. Now Ramah was on that crossroads of the major road that came up from Joppa and then continued on to Jericho and the north and south way of the patriarchs, which is today's Highway 60. Now the first place that David fled to, after he fled for his life from Saul's palace, was just north of Gibeah, at Ramah, where Samuel the prophet lived. Now Saul sent soldiers 3 times to get him here at Ramah, but God turned their heart to where they came back prophesying, probably in song, and then the very same thing happened to King Saul. Now God can actually control us against our natural will if he wants to, but he doesn't do that generally, as that would remove our free moral agency. Now this occasion, however, was one of those rare exceptions. Now about 11 kilometres northeast of Jerusalem is the valley of Michmash, in between the towns of Michmash and Geba. Now Jonathan approached the Philistine garrison on the northern side of the valley with his armour bearer and passed by 2 rocky crags, Bozez and Sina. Now Bozez means slippery and Sina means thorny. Now the 2 men single-handedly climbed the ramparts and attacked the garrison. They ended up killing 20 men within the space of about half an acre. Now panic then set in to the rest of the Philistine ranks as they awoke, and this was heightened by an earthquake. And the Philistines then started killing each other in the panic. Now in modern times, the British, after reading this story, copied Jonathan's tactics at the same location and defeated the Turks here during World War I. Now west of Ramah is the city of Gibeon, where the road to Joppa split into 2 different routes, via Beth Horon and the other via Kirjath Jearim on their way to the coast. Now Gibeon is identified with the site of Al-Jid, about 10 kilometres northwest of Jerusalem. Now after the destruction of Jericho and Ai, the Hivite people of Gibeon sent ambassadors to trick Joshua and his Israelites into making a treaty with them. They pretended to be foreigners rather than locals. They presented themselves as ambassadors from a distant, powerful land. Now, without consulting God, the Israelites foolishly entered in a covenant or peace treaty with the Gibeonites. Now, the Israelites soon found out that the Gibeonites were actually their neighbours. Now, Joshua kept the letter of his covenant with them to let them live in exchange for their servitude as woodcutters and water gatherers. Now, in retaliation for allying with the Israelites, the city was later besieged by a coalition of 5 Canaanite cities. Now, the Gibeons appealed to Joshua, who led the subsequent victory over the Canaanite armies. Now, in the book of Joshua, ancient Gibeon is described as a large city, like one of the royal cities located in Benjamin, and it would later become a Levitical city. Now, after marching up from Gilgal very early in the morning, the Israelites attacked the armies attacking Gibeon and pursued them down the Beth Horon Ridge amidst miraculous circumstances, including deadly hailstones, which actually killed more than the fighting, and the suspension of the movement of the sun and the moon, so the daylight part of the day was extended by another 12 hours. Now Joshua said for the moon to stand still over the valley of Ajalon to the west, and for the sun to stand still over Gibeon in the east. So we know from this it was still morning when Joshua asked for this to happen, not very long into the battle, so I suspect that this wasn't really Joshua's idea, but God who put that idea into his mind. Now it was also a clear enough day with the sun and moon visible, so the great hailstones were likely not to be ice, but to be meteorites. Now there's a pool at Gibeon that features in the story of the civil war between Israel and Judah after King Saul died, where there was one particular fierce battle between Abner's forces and Joab's forces. Now Abner kills Joab's brother, but Abner loses a lot more men in this particular battle. Now as mentioned before, it was also here where Jeremiah's party was rescued from Ishmael in the days after Babylon had conquered Jerusalem and had taken Judah off into captivity. Now just south of Gibeon is a large prominent mountain called Nebi Samuel, which is a few miles northwest of Jerusalem. Now it is likely to be the high place of Gibeon spoken of in the Bible, where the tabernacle was during the reign of David and the early part of Solomon's reign before the temple was built. Now the tabernacle after the destruction of Shiloh following the loss of the ark appears to have had two further homes before the temple was built. Now first it was moved to Nob, which is close to Saul's capital Gibeah, and then after Saul killed the priests who were there, it then came to this place, the high place of Gibeon. Now today this place is called Nebi Samuel, which means the prophet Samuel, as his alleged tomb is at this site. Now the Bible, however, tells us that Samuel was buried at his home in Ramah. Now this high place of Gibeon is where Solomon early in his reign came to worship and sacrifice to God. Now it was here that God appeared to Solomon in a vision and offered him a wish, to which he asked for wisdom to rule the people. Now shown here, just a short distance north of Jerusalem, is Saul's hometown Gibeah, that is today identified as Tel El-Ful, which is about 5 kilometres north of Jerusalem. Now Gibeah was Saul's capital when he ruled as king. Now David also lived here with his first wife Michal, who was Saul's daughter. Now that was up until Saul's jealousy saw David flee from Saul after Saul tried to kill him. Now you can notice a shell of a building there on the top of the tell here. Now King Hussein of Jordan began work on a royal palace here on the ancient tell. Now work stopped on it when the 1967-60 war began, and the area then became a part of Israel. Only really basically an outer shell remains there today. So you can just see Gibeah there in the foreground. Now just behind it, on that hill there, is a hill that some scholars identify as the biblical town of Nob, where David sought assistance from the priests when he was on the run. Now, not having any bread to spare, Ahimelech gave David some of the old showbread, as well as the sword of Goliath that David used to cut his head off. Now Saul then ordered for the priests to be killed for helping David, which was carried out by the Edomite Doeg, who ended up killing 85 priests. Now the mention of showbread here implies that the tabernacle was there with those many priests, and it was likely their death that led to the tabernacle then being moved to the high place of Gibeon. Now, only Ahimelech's son Abiathar escaped this horrible slaughter, and he took the high priest's ephod to David with the Urim and the Thummim, through which David could directly ask God for answers to questions that he had. Now, going a few miles south of Gibeah and Nob, we come to the great city at Benjamin's southern border, Jerusalem, which David conquered 7 years into his reign and made Israel's capital. Now, there is so much history to unpack with the city of Jerusalem that we won't be covering that today. I'll be covering that not just in the next message, but also the one after that. I'll be covering Old Testament Jerusalem next time, and then New Testament Jerusalem the time after that. Now, about 4 miles or 7 kilometres south of Jerusalem is the town of Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem is first mentioned in the Bible as the place near where Jacob's wife Rachel died while giving birth to Benjamin and was buried there. Now, her memorial tomb is located along the main road on the northern edge of Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem was also the home of Boaz and Ruth, and it was here where King David came from and tended sheep when he was young. Now, Jesus Christ, who is a direct descendant of David, was also born in Bethlehem. Now, his human parents, Joseph and Mary, were living in Nazareth, but just prior to the birth of Jesus, they ventured back to their ancestral city of Bethlehem to enrol in the Roman census at the same time that they went to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, Jesus said that he was the living bread, and the city that he was born in, Bethlehem, fittingly means the house of bread. Now, the Church of the Nativity, which is popularised as Jesus' birthplace, is in the centre of Bethlehem. Now, what is referred to as the Fields of Boaz is on the eastern side of Bethlehem near the Shepherd's Field. Now, Jesus and David were both direct descendants of Boaz, so if the Fields of Boaz is where his family inheritance was, then it's more likely that Jesus was born on the eastern side of Bethlehem. Now, the Greek word that is used for in Luke 2 verse 7 is kataluma, when it says that there was no room at the inn for Jesus' parents. Now, inn is a poor translation in this particular verse. Now, kataluma actually means a guest room. There's actually a different Greek word for a commercial inn that is used in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, it seems likely that other members were in the guest room at the time of Jesus' birth, which is calculated from the roster of John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, in the temple, which would put it around the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. It also says that shepherds were watching their sheep by night at this time. Now, this is something that never would have happened during the cold, rainy season in late December. Now, animals were valuable, and they were actually kept inside at night time in the lower level, which was likely where Joseph and Mary would have lodged in this particular Israelite house. A stone trough for feeding the animals filled with soft hay would have become a makeshift manger for Jesus. Now, if you notice in the diagram there, the pillars on each side of the lower courtyard where the animal stables were. Now, just keep that in mind when I show you a photo from the excavations at Hebron shortly. Now, once the Feast of Tabernacles was completed, that is likely when the kataluma in the house became available for Joseph and Mary. And so we see in Matthew 2:11, Jesus is not called a baby at this time, but a young child when the Magi arrived, while Joseph and Mary were some later time lodging in the house. Now, a little to the southwest of Bethlehem are what are referred to as the Pools of Solomon, though it may only date to the Maccabean or Roman times. Now, the water from the Gihon spring in the city of David was insufficient for the needs of the temple. Now Herod the Great brought water from the Etam spring and other water sources near Bethlehem directly via an aqueduct into Jerusalem and the temple. Now Bethlehem itself sits at an elevation of about 20 metres higher than Jerusalem. Now these giant pools here acted as reservoirs for that water system. Now the town of Tekoa is located about 12 kilometres or 7 miles southeast of Bethlehem. Now the word Tekoa in Hebrew means a stockade. Now during the reign of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, the Moabites formed a triple alliance with Edom and Ammon and marched against the kingdom of Judah. It's recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Now Jehoshaphat called on God to save Judah. Now God intervened and they quarrelled amongst themselves and slew one another, leaving the people of Judah only to go in and gather the rich spoils of the slain. Now Jehoshaphat sent out singers from the wilderness of Tekoa, and the people of Judah found all the dead bodies of this triple alliance that had come against them. Amos the prophet is referred to in the Bible as a herdsman of Tekoa. Now the prophet Amos prophesied not just against Judah, but also, in fact, he actually spoke more against the northern kingdom at its most southerly city at Bethel, where one of the golden calves were during the reign of Jeroboam II in the north and King Uzziah in the south, a few decades before Assyria conquered the northern kingdom. Now going further south, we reach the town of Mamre. Now it's a site just a little bit to the north of Hebron, where Abraham dwelt. Now the site shown here is believed to be Mamre, and today called Ramat el Khalil. Ramat or Ramoth is the Hebrew word that means heights, and Al Khalil means friend of God, a reference to Abraham. Now it's got a large enclosure around it, which was built over an earlier enclosure, thought to be dated possibly to the time of David. Now in the centre of the site are the remains of an altar. Now according to Genesis 13:18, Abraham built an altar here at Mamre. Now there's also a spring within the enclosure that is seen at the back of the photo on the top right. Now near a spring is a good place where trees would grow, such as the oaks that are described to have been here at Mamre. Now it was here, near the oak trees of Mamre, that the Lord appeared to Abraham to reconfirm his promise that he would have a son, and here that the Lord and Abraham discussed the fate of Sodom, which the Lord intended to destroy. Now the city of Hebron is generally believed to be the second most holy city to the Jews, because this is where the cave of the patriarchs is, where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah were all buried. Now notice in the bottom left photo the early bronze steps here. Now, it's quite possible that Abraham may have even walked on those steps that you see there. Now in that centre photo at the bottom there, you can see a grain silo with pillars in the background. So that they'll most likely be the stables of an Israelite house. Now Hebron was one of the places where the Anakim giants lived before Caleb led a victory over them during Joshua's conquest. Now Hebron was formerly called Kiryat Arba, meaning the city of Arba. Now Arba was the father of the Anakim giants. Now Hebron became the most important city in the tribal area of Judah, and David ruled here for 7 years prior to him conquering Jerusalem. Now, David most likely would have had a palace here as well. Now other than a few sherds of late bronze pottery, very little has been uncovered from the late bronze period, which is when the standard chronology places the Exodus and the conquest. Now in the revised chronology that I've been discussing in the series, the late bronze period is when David rules Judah for 7 years before he becomes king over both Israel and Judah, and moves his capital to Jerusalem. So, whichever way you go with the chronology, there is likely to be more evidence of a late Bronze city here at Hebron, most likely on the Acropolis, the likely site for David's palace. So that Acropolis is currently unexcavated due to the sensitive political nature of the situation there in the West Bank. Now, while it would have looked much different in David's time, he would have been able to look down directly to where the Machpelah cave was, where 3 couples of his direct lineage were all buried: Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah, who was the mother of Judah, from whom David was descended from. Now, King Herod, an Edomite who was raised in the Jewish religion, built this massive structure here above the caves. Now, its stones are very similar to the stones in the temple in Jerusalem, yet it wasn't destroyed by the Romans and has amazingly survived intact to this day. Now, today it is divided as it is part synagogue and part mosque. Now, there's an interesting story on a YouTube video where Nahum Arnim, a member of the Jewish community at Hebron, tells a story that he was a part of a group back in the 1980s that in the middle of the night broke through the floor stones and found a passageway down to the double cave where they found human bones and pottery and artefacts from the Middle Bronze and First Temple periods. And there's a photo there of what looks like the cave there. Now, after the death of Saul and the resulting civil war during the reign of David, 2 captains under Ishbosheth, seeing the writing on the wall that Judah was going to win, turned on Ishbosheth and they killed him. Now, they then went to David with his head, thinking that David would reward them for killing him. Now, David was horrified by what they had done, and he executed and hanged them by the pool in Hebron, which is likely to be this location here. Now, Hebron and Jerusalem were 2 of 5 cities that attacked Gibeon during Joshua's conquest of the land. Now, the 5 cities that allied together are shown here with a red border around them. Now, the other 3 cities, apart from Hebron and Jerusalem, were Yarmouth and Lachish in the Shephelah, and Eglon in the highlands. Now, Eglon today is believed to be Tel Eitun, shown in the bottom left photo. Now, the Israelites pursued the armies down the Beth Horon Ridge, and they then turned down south along the Shephelah to Azekah and Makkedah, there in the middle of the map. Now, Makkedah is believed to be Khirbet el-Qom, east of Lachish, shown in the top left photo there. Now, the 5 kings then hid themselves in a cave near Makkedah, but were eventually found and executed. Now, Joshua continued his conquest of southern Canaan by then conquering Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, and then finishing further south with Debir, which is believed to be Khirbet Rabun, shown in the bottom right. Now, there are 3 locations southeast of Hebron, close to the road that goes from Hebron down to Arad, which feature in the story of Saul chasing after David. Now, after David's time at En-Gedi, David is next noted as being in Carmel, where he meets Abigail, who was the wife of the foolish man Nabal. Now, when most people think of Carmel, they immediately think of Mount Carmel up in the north of Israel. Now, following Nabal's death, we read that David took Abigail as wife, as well as a lady called Ahinoam of Jezreel. And we also know that there's a Jezreel too up in the north close to Mount Carmel. Now, that said, there is also both a Carmel and a Jezreel, both in Judah. So it's likely to be the one in Judah. Now, it says in 1 Samuel 25 that Nabal was from Moab and his business and where he sheared his sheep was in Carmel. Now the Judean Carmel is very close to the town of Moan. Now in the next chapter, David is then in the wilderness of Ziph, where Saul continues to pursue him. Now we read the story about how God put a deep sleep over Saul and his men, and David snuck in to the camp and took Saul's jug and his spear. Now he later shouted from a distance away that he had them to prove to Saul that he could have killed him if he wanted to. Now, to the east of the watershed, where the highlands are, it becomes much drier and arid, forming the Judean wilderness right up to the cliffs that descended sharply down to the Dead Sea. Now, just north of the Dead Sea was the major city of Jericho in the Judean desert or wilderness, which is near a natural oasis. Now, Gilgal, to its east, was where the Israelites first camped after crossing the Jordan River before conquering Jericho. Now, further south on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea is the town of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Now, we'll also explore Herod's fortress close to Bethlehem, En-Gedi, the spring oasis where David hid from Saul, as well as the mighty fortress of Masada. Now, to the southeast of Bethlehem was one of the great architectural wonders of Herod the Great, the Herodion. Now, the Herodion was a man-made mountain with a great palace and fortress on the inside. Now, Herod actually literally moved a nearby hill and placed on top of another to create the Herodion. Now, did Jesus perhaps have this feature in mind when he spoke about having faith as a mustard seed that could move a mountain? Now, there's a principle in Jewish teaching called how much more, in the sense that if men can do this, then how much more can God do? So if Herod can move a mountain, then how much more can God do? Now, halfway along the western shore of the Dead Sea is the spring oasis of En-Gedi with its lush vegetation and living flowing water, which is a great contrast to the nearby Dead Sea. Now, the Bible paints this contrast between living water that flowed in contrast to the static water that was stored in cisterns. And the Holy Spirit itself is compared to living water. Now, there's quite a few spring-fed pools here at En-Gedi, and this wonderful waterfall that you can see right here. And when he was pursuing David, Saul went into a cave that he didn't realise that David was in order to relieve himself. Now, David's men see this as God's way of delivering Saul into David's hands. And David rejected that viewpoint and chose not to kill him. Instead, he cut off a corner from his robe to prove to Saul that he didn't wish to harm him. Now, I wonder if one of these caves I took a photo of may have been the cave that Saul went into. Now, there are quite a number of small pools and waterfalls around the national park here. We also saw lots of ibexes as we went into the national park, and they're likely to be the deer that are spoken of in Psalms when David sings, "As the deer pants for and longs for living water, so my soul longs for you." Now, the photo on the right here is Gabriel telling me that he's cut off a piece of my robe. Now, when the Triple Alliance of Moab, Edom and Ammon came around the Dead Sea to come and attack Judah in the time of Jehoshaphat, the prophet Jahaziel told Jehoshaphat, "They will surely come up by the ascent of Ziz, and you will find them at the end of the brook before the wilderness of Jeruel." Now, the ascent of Ziz is an impressive steep ascent that allows one to climb up the cliffs of the Judean wilderness near En-Gedi and access the highlands of Judah. Now further south, near the bottom of the Dead Sea, on its western side is the fortress of Masada, built on an isolated rock plateau. Now Herod the Great built a palace for himself on the mountain and he fortified Masada. Now according to Josephus, the siege of Masada by Roman troops from 73 to 74 AD, at the end of the Jewish-Roman War, ended in the mass suicide of 960 Sicarii rebels who were hiding here at Masada. Now to get up there, the Romans had to build a siege ramp. Now in this great aerial photo here, you can see on Masada's western side the siege ramp, that white ramp there in the middle of the photo. And you can also see below it one of the square-shaped Roman camps. Now the Dead Sea is a salt lake that lies at the bottom of the Jordan Rift Valley. Now the Jordan River flows into it, but due to its low elevation, it has no outlet. Now the Dead Sea is about 430 metres or 1,400 feet below sea level, making it the lowest place on Earth on land. Now it's actually 10 times as salty as the ocean, making it impossible for any fish to live in it, as well as making objects and people in it quite buoyant. Now in Ezekiel 47, there is a prophecy that the sea will be healed and made fresh, becoming a normal lake capable of supporting marine life. Now a similar prophecy is stated in Zechariah 14:8, which says that living waters will go out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, likely the Dead Sea, and half to the western sea, which is the Mediterranean. So that would probably mean that it might have to be raised up from below sea level, so it has an outlet. Now the Great Rift of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea bears witness to a tremendous upheaval. Now Professor M. Blankenhorn wrote the following about this valley. With the end of the Tertiary period, in an event of extreme violence, the entire Syrian land from its south end to its north end was torn apart and the ground in between sank into the depths. And we read in Genesis 14:3, all these joined together in the valley of Siddim, and in brackets that is the Salt Sea. And that implies that the valley of Siddim is where the Dead Sea is now. So one possibility is that the Dead Sea may not have even yet been in existence during the time of Abraham. Now going further north, at the top of the Dead Sea is the town of Qumran, which is an archaeological site in the West Bank located on a dry plateau close to the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. Now the settlement was constructed around the 2nd century BC and was settled by a sect called the Essenes. Now today the Qumran site is best known for the Qumran caves, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found between 1947 and 1956, which included original copies of various books of the Old Testament. Now to the west of Jericho is Wadi Kelt, which is a valley or stream that runs in between the two ancient roads of the Zeboim route that went up from Jericho to Bethel and Ramah, and the ascent of Adumim that went from Jericho to Jerusalem. Now both of those roads followed along the ridgetops. Now Wadi Kelt has two main tributaries, Nahal Prat that goes up just past Anatoth, where Jeremiah came from, and Wadi Suanet that went up past Michmash further north. Now a couple of places of note along the ascent of Adumim here are St George's Monastery along the lower part of Wadi Kelt, close to Jericho there, and the Inn of the Good Samaritan about halfway along the route. Now it's possible that David may have had Wadi Kelt in mind when he wrote Psalm 23 and spoke of the valley of the shadow of death. Now the road along Wadi Kelt was narrow and dangerous, and Jesus referred to this road in his parable of the Good Samaritan. Now an inn that has served pilgrims along the road for centuries has ruins that go back to the Hellenistic and Roman times, where it may have served a similar purpose and could have been a location that Jesus had in mind when he gave the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, the largest city in the Judean wilderness was Jericho, which had an oasis of palm trees. Now, the ancient Tel is known today as Tel es Sultan, and it has had several major excavations. Now, John Garstang in the 1930s excavated Jericho and reported that he had found Joshua's Jericho. Now, Kathleen Kenyon later excavated Jericho again much more thoroughly in the 1950s and discovered the burnt walls of Garstang actually belonged to an earlier period, the early Bronze Age, centuries before Joshua's time. Now, she found that there was no wall around the city at all during the late Bronze Age, when the Exodus is usually dated. Now, Kenyon discovered another toppled and burnt wall in the Middle Bronze II period. Now, Kathleen Kenyon, in a report on Jericho's Middle Bronze Age destruction, showed that the lower of the two brick walls that stood on top of the stone retaining wall collapsed, providing a rampart up to the city for the Israelites to go up to the city. Now, she found that the city was also burnt by fire, just as the Bible records in Joshua chapter 6. Now, archaeologist and Israel tour guide Joel Kramer here shows one section where there is still some remnant of the ramp created by what Kenyon called fallen red bricks in a trench cutout illustration. Now, the red brick wall was originally just above the top of the stone retaining wall before it fell down. Now, all around the city, they actually found storage jars full of grain. Now, this tells us three things. Firstly, it indicates a quick attack, not a long siege, which is unusual given how impressive its double walls were. So second, it was near harvest time, and the Bible places the conquest of Jericho at the time of the barley harvest, when the Passover was kept. Now, they actually analysed the grain and found that grain to be barley, which is not surprising. And thirdly, it was not spoiled by its attackers, which again agrees with the biblical account in Joshua 6. Now, what natural reason would there be for conquerors not to take all that grain which was valuable to any people of the time? Now, only the Bible gives us the reason, that God had decreed it. It was kind of like a first fruits offering to God, trusting Him for the rest of the blessings that would come from the conquest. Now, it's interesting too, as Joel Kramer notes, that they crossed the Jordan at the worst time when it was in flood, and they also attacked Jericho at the worst time when the people of Jericho had just gathered in their grain, allowing them to have plenty of food if they were besieged. Now, when Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho in the 1950s, she dated the earliest walls to the early Bronze Age period. Now, after its destruction, the city expanded in the Middle Bronze period, and its larger double walls were destroyed at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Now, she found no wall whatsoever during the Late Bronze Age and found it to be unoccupied during that period, when the Exodus is usually dated. Now, according to Kenyon, the site was unoccupied during the Late Bronze period, though some 18th dynasty Late Bronze scarabs were found in nearby tombs. Now, the reference to Jericho in 2 Samuel 10 suggests that even though the place was not resettled as a proper town until the time of Hiel, a military or trading post existed there during the reign of David. Now, following a very long period of no occupation, a late bronze structure is then rebuilt over the ruins. Now, this would represent not the time of the conquest, but the rebuilding by Hiel, who suffered the curse of losing his two sons when he rebuilt the city. Now, Brian Wood has advocated redating the Middle Bronze pottery to the Late Bronze Age, so the archaeology can be reconciled with the standard chronology's Late Bronze date for the Exodus and the conquest. Now, in a previous message in my series, we looked at Shechem, and we saw how that failed to reconcile the archaeology and the Bible in regards to the three-step pattern there at Shechem of the destruction of the fortress temple during the time of Judges, a century or more of no occupation, followed by a rebuild of Shechem, which puts the time, which the Bible puts in the time of Jeroboam. Now, the simpler, better fitting solution is to accept the Middle Bronze Age destruction date by the archaeologists and to correct the Egyptian chronology so this destruction matches up with the biblical date of 1400 for the conquest. Now, in the account of Jericho's conquest, Rahab lived along the city wall where she was protected. Now, the left photo here shows houses that actually built into the very wall itself. And on the right photo there's a small section of the mud brick walls which did not collapse, which may have been where Rahab's place was. Now, after the Israelites crossed the Jordan River and before they conquered Jericho, they camped east of Jericho at a place called Gilgal. Now, today there are no real archaeological remains of note there. Now, the Gilgal at the time of the conquest was just east of Jericho, shown here as Camp Gilgal on the map on the left. Now, the name Gilgal was a generic name that means stone circle, and there are about 3 locations by this name noted in the Bible. Now, about halfway up the Jordan Valley on the way to Bethshen, on the slopes just north of where Wadi Farah meets the Jordan, is a site where there is a double stone edging that has the appearance of a shoe. Now, it is shown on the map on the left here as Tel Gilgal. Now, Israeli archaeologist Adam Zutel found at least 6 of these type of stone monuments shaped like a shoe in Israel. Now, this one may or may not have been the Gilgal spoken of at the time of King Saul. Now, this particular one here has an altar, and it's also got a 12-stone monument. Now, we read in the Bible after they crossed the Jordan, they were told to take 12 stones from the Jordan and build a monument at Gilgal. Now, the significance of the shoe shape is seen in Joshua 1:3, which says, "Every place on which the sole of your feet treads, I have given you." It's as if they were making a statement, staking their claim to the land. Now, giving a shoe, like at the end of the story in the book of Ruth, was a symbol of the transfer of the right to redeem the land. Now, the Negev is the most southerly region in Israel, hence its name Negev, which means south. Now, today the term is used for the entire region from Beersheba and Arad all the way down to Eilat. So in ancient times, the term Negev was used for the area from west of Beersheba to Arad in the east, shown in green on the map on the right. Now, like the Judean wilderness, it varies between semi-arid to arid for most of the south. Now, Beersheba was the largest city of the Negev, and it was an important place in the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The tribe of Simeon was allotted a small area in and around Beersheba, but the tribe appears to have relocated somewhere in the north after the division of the kingdom following Solomon, as only Benjamin and the Levites remained loyal to Judah, who were allotted most of the Negev. Now, the towns of Arad, Hormah, and the wilderness of Zin all feature in the story of the wandering of the Israelites and their first conquests in the land. Now, Timnah in the south was famous for its copper mines exploited by the Egyptians and probably Solomon as well. Now, today there's a full-size replica of the tabernacle there at Timnah. And at the very bottom there is Eilat, which sits on the Gulf of Aqaba, close to the biblical city of Ezion-Geber. Now, Beersheba was at the southern end of the Way of the Patriarchs, or that ridge route, after the descent from Hebron, before it became the way to Shur and continued then on to Egypt. Now, we read in Genesis how Abimelech's men had taken the well from Abraham after he had previously dug a well there at Beersheba. Now, Abraham set aside 7 lambs to swear that he had dug the well. Now, Abimelech conceded and that it belonged to Abraham, and he made a covenant with Abraham. Now, the word Sheba can mean both oath and also seven, and so Beersheba means both well of the seven or well of the oath. Now, a few kilometres to the east of the old city of Beersheba is a vast tell, today called Tel Beersheba. Now, that name probably is a case of mistaken identity, as it was named Tel Es-Seba during World War I, while the old city was called Beer-Es-Sheba. Now, its ruins only go back as far as the late Bronze Age and not back to Abraham's time. So it probably should be called Tel Sheba, like the modern town that's next to it. Now, both Abraham and Isaac dug wells here at Beersheba. Now, there happens to actually be two wells at the Abraham's Well International Visitor Centre in the old city in modern Beersheba today. Now, these wells are perhaps the best candidates for being the wells of Abraham and Isaac. It's at Beersheba in the Bible where God asked Abraham to go up to the land of Moriah to offer Isaac, and also where Jacob tricks Isaac to give him the blessing before he's packed off and sent to Haran. Now, in modern times, the Battle of Beersheba was a part of the wider British offensive aimed at breaking the Turkish defensive line from Gaza up to Beersheba during World War I. Now, on October 31st, 1917, approximately 500 soldiers of the Australian Light Horse Brigade, with only horses and bayonets, charged the Turkish trenches, overran them, and captured the wells in what became known as the Battle of Beersheba, called the last successful cavalry charge in British military history. Now, it became a turning point in liberating Palestine from the Ottoman Turks. Now, after the Israelites had completed their 40 wilderness years, they began to move, and the king of Arad, hearing about it, attacked the Israelites. Now, the Israelites defeated them at a place called Hormah, which is believed to be Tel Masos, which is just a little southwest of Arad. Now, Arad is in the eastern part of the Negev, south of Hebron. Now, Tel Arad had two major settlement periods, a Canaanite period and also an Israelite period. So we're looking here at the Iron Age Israelite fortress, and in that northwest corner on our top right is a three-part shrine with similarities to the temple that has two small standing stones in front of its holy place. So you can see the two standing stones there in front of the holy place there. Incense residue on one of those stones was actually found to have had cannabis mixed in with it. Now, we're now coming up to the Canaanite settlement. Now, the Canaanites were the original settlers of Arad and established a large city before they were defeated by the Israelites after they'd finished their wilderness wanderings. Now, Mazar, in the book The Archaeology of Ancient Israel, makes it clear that the standard dating of the conquest in the late Bronze Age is contradicted by archaeology. She writes, systematic excavations in all the mounds of the Beersheba Valley, which includes Arad here, found no late Bronze Age settlement. That unequivocal archaeological fact should be taken into account when evaluating the historical reliability of the biblical tradition concerning this region. Does the tradition reflect an earlier period, perhaps the Middle Bronze Age too, when the area was settled by Canaanites? End of quote. So again, the evidence of archaeology points to a conquest in the Middle Bronze Age, which best fits the revised chronology that we've looked at in this series. Now, the Israelite shrine in the fortress that you can see up there on the left there was buried with a soft burial of dirt. Now, it was likely being used in a corrupted form of Yahweh worship before it was buried during the reforms of King Hezekiah. Now, this drone footage is taken from the western end of Nahal, or the Valley of Zin, which is around 30 kilometres southeast of Beersheba. Now, in the book of Numbers, Kadesh, where the Israelites were during their 40 years in the wilderness, is said to be both in the wilderness of Zin and the wilderness of Paran. Now, the wilderness of Zin is believed to be Nahal Zin. Now, the wilderness of Zin appears to also be a smaller part of the much larger wilderness of Paran. Now, Kadesh in other verses is referred to by the longer term Kadesh Barnea. Now, Kadesh means holy, and Barnea is thought to mean place of wandering. So it gets its name from the wandering of the Israelites in that area. Now, Kadesh Barnea is usually located at Ain el-Kadirat, southwest of Nahal Zin, and a very long way from the Arabah Valley. Now, Deuteronomy 1:2 says that to get from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, you have to get there by the way of Mount Seir, which is in Jordan, the road up the Arabah Valley. So this is more likely to be that place than that much further west Kadesh recognised today. Now, Kadesh was where the spies were sent out from to spy the land when God sentenced. It was where God sentenced the Israelites for 40 years of wandering for their rebellion, and also where this would have been where Korah's rebellion would have taken place. Now, this particular spot here that we're seeing at the end of this video here is in Sidi Boker. And we're looking here at the tomb of Israel's first Prime Minister, Ben Gurion, who's buried here overlooking the valley. Now, the wilderness of Zin appears to be a smaller part of the much larger wilderness of Paran. Now, while Negev is used for that whole arid southern part of Israel all the way down to the Red Sea, the biblical term for this area appears to be the wilderness of Paran. Now, within it is one of Israel's natural wonders that you pass through on the way from Nahal Zin down to Eilat, and that is the Ramon crater shown here in two of the photos. Now, it was formed geologically and not by meteorite, though the name might suggest that. Now, to the east of Nahal Zin is the Arabah Valley, going all the way down from the Dead Sea to the Red Sea's Gulf of Aqaba, where Eilat is. Now, as you go south along the Arabah Valley down towards Eilat and the Red Sea, you actually very gradually climb to get back up to sea level. Now, on the eastern side of the valley there, you can see the towering mountains of Edom and Seir, where Petra is. Now, they tower over 1,000 metres or up to 4,000 feet above the valley floor. Now, the Timna Valley is located about 30 kilometres or 20 miles north of Eilat on the Red Sea. Now, this area here is rich in copper ore and has been mined since antiquity. Now, the Timna Valley contains some 10,000 copper mines and smelting camps, rock drawings and Egyptian shrines. Now, it was heavily mined for its copper by the Egyptians, and the evidence also suggests that Solomon probably heavily mined copper here as well. Now, also at Timna Park is this life-size replica of the biblical tabernacle that God instructed Moses to build, which has been constructed in the park and is a popular tourist attraction. Now, Eilat is Israel's southernmost city with a population of about 50,000. It's a very busy port and a popular tourist resort at the northern tip of the Red Sea on the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, Ezion-Geber was one of the places where the Israelites camped during the Exodus on their way from Mount Sinai to Kadesh, and it was located close to where Eilat is today. Now, the ships of Tarshish of Solomon and Hiram started from this port on their voyage to Ophir. And we also read that Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, joined with Ahaziah, the king of Israel, to make ships in Ezion-Geber, but God disapproved of this alliance, and the ships were broken in the port after a very, very fierce storm. So, now we've travelled all the way from Mount Hermon in the very north down to Eilat in the very south of Israel. So that completes the fourth in this series. Now, in the next part of the series, we'll begin to explore the great city of Jerusalem with its long and rich history. As I mentioned, I originally planned to do this in one message. However, as I started preparing it, I found out that I needed to do it in two messages. So next time we'll be exploring Old Testament Jerusalem, and then after that we'll cover New Testament Jerusalem. Thank you.